From launching the most successful horror franchises in history, to directing billion-dollar blockbusters that saved entire studios, James Wan has quietly built one of the most impressive catalogs in modern cinema, with a financial journey unlike anything we've covered on this channel.
As humans, we love to be scared, you know, from the dawn of time, we love telling stories and we love the thrill of being scared, and that's why I think scary movies always work so well.
In this video, we'll be breaking down the budgets, the box office numbers, and the production backstories of every movie directed by James Wan, to figure out how a young filmmaker went from making small independent movies to becoming one of the most commercially successful directors in cinema history. Before James became one of horror's biggest directors, he was just a young kid who grew up in Perth, Australia, with a huge obsession for horror films. While in film school, James met a fellow filmmaker named Lee Wannell, and the two would go on to change independent movie making forever.
We were straight out of high school when we got into college. We were about 17 back then, and I guess that really did draw us together because that was the common ground.
They shared a collective belief that they could create something darker and much more disturbing than what was coming out of Australia at the time.
Hello. Do you want to play a game?
Saw opens with two men waking up chained on opposite sides of a bathroom, with a dead body lying between them on the floor. One of the men is a photographer named Adam, while the other is a surgeon named Lawrence Gordon. The game is simple in its cruelty. Dr. Gordon has to kill Adam by a specified time, or his own family will be murdered. None of the men really know why they've been chosen, and as they try and piece the situation together, the audience also pieces together the larger architecture of Jigsaw's philosophy. The story slowly builds towards one of the most famous twist endings that cemented the film as an all-time classic. James and Lee started developing the idea for the film in the early 2000s, based on their shared fears and love of psychological horror.
It has to do with the script and the story and the characters that Lee and I worked on, that we spent 2 years basically crafting. And what that allowed me to do is I got to know their characters really well. And so when I was pitching to them about how I would like them to play it and what I would like them to do and how it's different to other horror films, I'm coming from a perspective and a point of view that is very much had grown up with the characters, you know, when Lee and I were working on the script and all that.
After writing the script, they scraped together $7,000 to shoot an 8-minute short film as a proof of concept, something they could use to show studios what Saw could become. With no industry connections and barely any money, James and Lee took a leap of faith and flew to Los Angeles, carrying copies of the short and hoping someone would take a chance on them. After countless rejections, the short eventually found its way to Twisted Pictures, a small production company that immediately saw potential in the concept and offered them $1.2 million to expand it into a feature film. And when Saw finally hit the theaters, it surpassed even the most optimistic expectations, grossing over $100 million at the box office, more than 80 times the cost of the production budget, instantly becoming one of the most profitable horror films ever made. It made $18 million in its opening week, earning nearly 15 times its entire production budget in just 3 days. This success instantly transformed James Wan from an unknown filmmaker into one of the most talked about new directors in modern cinema, proving he could create massive audience interest with extremely small budgets, a reputation that would define much of his career. Saw currently holds a 50% critics score, which proved how divided the critics were on the movie's graphic violence and grim atmosphere. But despite the mixed reviews, audiences embraced the originality and tension, helping turn the movie into a massive word-of-mouth success. But James wasn't interested in repeating himself, so he chose to step away and prove he could create horror outside of Jigsaw's shadow. Dead Silence follows Jamie Ashen, a man who returns to his hometown after his wife is mysteriously murdered shortly after receiving a ventriloquist doll. After the massive success of Saw, Universal was eager to lock James into a multi-picture deal. They gave him a budget of $20 million, nearly 17 times what he had for his debut, and full creative freedom to develop an original horror project. One wanted to make a throwback to classic horror films, built around a single terrifying image.
We wanted to create a doll that isn't just straight away outright scary. We wanted it to have like some malevolent quality.
This was his first opportunity to work with bigger sets, more elaborate cinematography, and practical creature effects. At the box office, Dead Silence grossed a little over $22 million worldwide during its theatrical run, losing millions for Universal Studios. For a director coming off a blockbuster hit, this was considered a major step backwards. Saw had become such a phenomenon, audiences expected another brutal, fast-paced horror film. Instead, Dead Silence was a slow-burning gothic ghost story, creating a disconnect between expectations and reality. For James, Dead Silence was an important reality check. It proved that following up a breakout hit was far harder than making one in the first place. But instead of retreating completely back into supernatural horror, Wan made an unexpected turn. A successful businessman named Nick Humes gets his world turned upside down after his son gets randomly murdered at a gas station. After identifying the killer in court, Nick becomes the target of the gang, who becomes hell-bent on seeking revenge. Desperate to protect his family, Nick slowly transforms from an ordinary father into a violent vigilante, dragging himself deeper into a brutal cycle of revenge that quickly spirals out of control. Unlike most revenge thrillers where the hero becomes unstoppable, Death Sentence constantly shows the physical and emotional damage caused by violence, making every decision feel ugly and tragic. The movie is based on a novel by Brian Garfield, and Wan saw an opportunity to make something completely different from supernatural horror, a grounded, gritty thriller about a man destroyed by his own rage.
Well, I came across the script a while ago when I was in the middle of Dead Silence. One of the reasons why I was attracted to this particular project is, is because I've been a big fan of revenge films for a long time. I love the revenge genre.
Fox gave him a substantial budget of $20 million and cast Kevin Bacon, who was coming off a career resurgence. But unfortunately, this approach didn't quite land well at the box office. Death Sentence grossed a little under $17 million, which was a huge financial disappointment, barely covering the cost of the production, let alone the marketing. By 2007, audiences weren't particularly interested in mid-budget revenge thrillers. Horror movies were booming, superhero films were becoming more dominant, and Death Sentence found itself stuck between genres. And with a 20% approval score, critics obviously had nothing nice to say about it. The guy who just reinvented the independent landscape and horror filmmaking just 3 years earlier was now being called a fluke and a one-hit wonder. To switch things up, James would have to give up the studio cushion and bet everything on himself, and this decision would lead to another commercial and critical masterpiece. After Dead Silence and Death Sentence failed to find the success many expected, James Wan was once again being overlooked by Hollywood. They had given him opportunities outside of horror, but the results hadn't justified bigger budgets or larger creative freedom. Instead of continuing to chase expensive studio projects, he scaled everything down and went back to the basics. With a production cost of $1.5 million, James reunited with Lee, the creative partner who helped launch Saw. James wanted to make a horror film that relied on atmosphere, tension, and old-school scares rather than gore. At the time, horror was becoming increasingly associated with torture-heavy films and graphic violence, a trend that Saw itself had helped popularize. Ironically, James wanted to move in the opposite direction.
The initial concept was something we cooked up, many years ago when we were trying to come up with ideas to make a smaller budget horror film.
Insidious follows a young couple whose life begins to unravel after their young son suddenly falls into an unexplained coma, following a strange incident in their new home. As unexplained disturbances escalate, it becomes clear that their son is not medically unconscious, but instead trapped in a dark parallel dimension, filled with dangerous entities that want to cross into the real world through him. James builds the horror in this film through silence, space, and anticipation. This minimalist approach allowed the film to maintain a constant sense of unease, while keeping production costs extremely low. But despite its modest budget, the movie became a massive commercial success, earning over $100 million worldwide, a return of more than 60 times its production budget, making it one of the most profitable horror films ever produced at the time, in relation to its cost. James and Lee retained a meaningful share of those profits, giving them an enormous financial foundation they had never had before. Insidious currently holds a 66% critic score, as some praised Wan's ability to build tension and create genuinely unsettling scares without relying on excessive gore, while others felt the film lost some of its mystery once it started revealing too much in the second half. But regardless, as successful as Insidious was, James was only getting started. His next project was about to redefine modern supernatural horror for an entire generation, and once again, launch one of the biggest horror franchises in cinema history.
By the power of God, I condemn you back to hell!
The Conjuring began with a script by Chad and Kerry Hayes, based on the real-life case files of Ed and Lorraine Warren, two of the most famous and controversial paranormal investigators in American history. The story follows Ed and Lorraine as they investigate the Perron family's farmhouse in Rhode Island at the request of a woman named Carolyn. Strange and escalating events have been occurring since her family moved in, and as the Warrens begin to investigate, they uncover evidence of a deeply dark, evil presence connected to the property's history. Unlike Insidious, which explored fear through astral projection, The Conjuring grounds its horror in spiritual warfare and the idea that evil can infiltrate the most intimate parts of domestic life. The movie constantly creates the feeling that something is lurking just outside the frame, allowing the anticipation itself to become part of the horror. New Line Cinema and Warner Bros. Backed the film with a budget of $20 million, and James was determined to maximize that budget to the possible best of his abilities. He shot in chronological order on a remote farmhouse in North Carolina. Warner Bros. Initially pushed him to tone the film down for a PG-13 rating to maximize its potential, but James refused, stating that he would rather make a pure, uncompromising horror film than a sanitized version built for wider distribution.
We prove it time and time again, you know, like you have Paranormal Activity, you have the Blair Witch Project, right? Those movies were made for nothing, right? And you hardly ever see anything, right? But the sound really gets you, okay? And so The Conjuring, I wanted the visual to be strong, but I need the sound to be even stronger.
Ultimately, the studios agreed, and the film was finally released. At the box office, The Conjuring grossed over $320 million worldwide, becoming one of the most profitable horror movies ever made, and completely changed the commercial perception of supernatural horror in Hollywood. This was now the third time James was establishing a mega horror franchise. The success of this film launched a franchise that expanded into multiple spin-offs and would go on to generate billions at the global box office. Critically, The Conjuring received some of the strongest reviews of James Wan's career at the time, holding an impressive 86% critic score. Many people viewed it as proof that mainstream horror could still be intelligent, patient, and genuinely frightening without depending entirely on random violence and unnecessary blood. After The Conjuring, James became one of the most sought-after horror directors in Hollywood. The industry was lining up with offers, but before he moved on to his next chapter, he went back to revisit one of his most iconic creations. Insidious Chapter 2 picks up immediately after the events of the first film. Josh Lambert has returned from the further after rescuing his son, but something is wrong. His behavior becomes erratic and frightening. His wife begins to fear that the man who came back from the astral plane is not entirely her husband. James began filming this second installment just weeks after he wrapped up post-production on The Conjuring. The budget was set for $5 million, which was more than triple the budget of the first film, but still incredibly small compared to most studio horror releases. By this point, James had fully embraced the formula that made him a powerhouse, which was keeping costs low and keeping full creative freedom, the same concept Shyamalan had applied in his later works. This approach paid off once again as the movie went on to earn over $161 million worldwide, significantly outperforming its predecessor, which was extremely rare for a horror sequel. It grossed over $40 million in its opening weekend, more than 7 times its entire production budget in just 3 days, giving James his second major hit of the year. Just 2 months earlier, The Conjuring had dominated the box office for weeks straight. The only other director to pull off 2 major hits in the same year was Spielberg, with Jurassic Park and Schindler's List. With another horror franchise locked in, James Wan found himself facing a challenge unlike anything in his career. Instead of random ghosts and haunted houses, his next move was taking on one of the biggest blockbuster franchises in cinema history. Furious 7 follows Dominic Toretto and his crew as they're hunted by Deckard Shaw, a typical ruthless bad guy seeking revenge for the events of the previous film. At the same time, they're recruited by a mysterious government operative to recover some random powerful surveillance program capable of locating anyone on Earth. So what starts as a revenge story quickly escalates into a globe-trotting blockbuster filled with exploding cars, collapsing buildings, and some of the franchise's most outrageous action sequences. For James Wan, this was a completely different challenge. Up until this point, the biggest budget he had ever worked with was $20 million. Now, after proving himself with a string of highly successful independent films, he was being handed the keys to a billion-dollar franchise and a production budget of $200 million, a gigantic leap into an entirely different league of filmmaking.
I want to try and honor all the great things that the previous filmmakers have done before me, and sort of keep it in the same tone, keep it sort of in the same world, but try and bring some of the visual stamps, the kind of visual stuff that I love aesthetically.
But then, from nowhere, the production was hit by a tragedy no one could have ever anticipated. In November 2013, with filming already in process, Paul Walker was killed in an untimely car accident. The loss devastated the cast, crew, and fan base. Production was temporarily shut down as the cast, crew, and the studios grappled on how to finish the film after losing one of its central stars. Eventually, production resumed and James reworked the story, using visual effects and the help of Paul Walker's brother to complete several uncompleted scenes. What could have ended the project instead became one of the most remarkable production efforts in modern blockbuster filmmaking. And when the film was finally released in theaters, it became an absolute phenomenon, grossing over $1.5 billion worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing films ever released at the time. A monumental success by any measure, and a great achievement for James' career. The emotion surrounding Walker's passing, combined with the story of how the film was completed, created a level of audience investment that went far beyond a typical franchise release. Critically, the film was also a huge success, holding a very impressive 81% approval score and an 82% audience score. Many people praised James' ability to maintain the franchise's energy while bringing a stronger emotional core to the story. This was a defining moment in his filmography. He had gone from a very successful indie filmmaker to a global blockbuster, and the industry was now at his feet. After proving he could handle one of the biggest franchises on the planet, James could have chased another action blockbuster, but instead, he returned back to the genre that made him famous. The second installment of The Conjuring came with a different kind of pressure. The first movie had already surprised Hollywood and introduced audiences to Ed and Lorraine. Now the challenge was finding a story that could expand the world without feeling like a simple repeat of the original. With the success of the first film, the studio doubled up the budget, giving James a $40 million cushion, and that increase allowed James to create a bigger experience, with more elaborate sets, and a story that moved beyond a single location. Instead of bringing audiences back to another American haunted house, the story moved across the world to England, focusing on the famous Enfield poltergeist case, one of the most documented and controversial paranormal events in history. This case involved a family in London who claimed their home was being haunted by a supernatural presence. As Ed and Lorraine investigates, Lorraine begins experiencing visions of her own death, visions she believes are sent by a demonic entity that has been manipulating the entire situation from the beginning. This second installment digs a little deeper than the first, as it builds towards a confrontation that tests the Warrens' faith in their mission, and also their faith in each other. The original film focused on a family dealing with an evil presence inside their home, but the sequel expanded the idea of fear by exploring the feeling that danger can follow you anywhere. The movie went on to earn over $320 million at the global box office, which ironically matched the revenue from the first film. The movie's success also proved something important for Hollywood, that horror franchises could survive beyond one movie if the filmmakers created a strong foundation. The Conjuring didn't rely only on random monster or a gimmick. The audience was returning because they cared about the characters. After conquering the world of supernatural horror, James Wan was ready to take on his biggest challenge yet. Leaving behind ghosts and demons, with the pressure of bringing one of its most iconic heroes to life, and to help save the fate of the DC universe. Aquaman follows Arthur Curry, a buff, handsome geezer from Atlantis who spent most of his life above water with the regular Earth folks. But unfortunately for him, his half-brother decides that humanity has been disrespecting the oceans a little too much, and responds with the completely reasonable solution of flooding the entire planet. Naturally, Arthur is dragged into a battle for a throne he never wanted, and a kingdom he never asked to rule. After the enormous success of Furious 7, James Wan had proven he could handle blockbuster filmmaking. The question now wasn't whether he could direct a major franchise, it was whether he could help save one. At the time, the DC Extended Universe was struggling to find consistent footing. While films like Wonder Woman had found success, others had divided audiences and critics. Aquaman presented a unique challenge because on paper, the character wasn't exactly considered a guaranteed box office draw. James understood this problem immediately. Warner Bros. Gave him a significant budget of $160 million. The studio wasn't just hoping for a hit, they desperately needed one. Rather than trying to make a dark, grounded superhero movie, James leaned into the exact opposite approach. If audiences were going to spend 2 hours underwater, then he wanted to give them something they had never seen before. He used groundbreaking visual effects to create the fantastical underwater city of Atlantis, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with CGI.
You know, whether it's a sort of a horror movie set piece or it is an action set piece, you know, paying attention to the detail and also kind of coming out with sort of visuals and choreography of the way something plays out in a way that you kind of haven't quite seen before.
When Aquaman finally arrived in theaters, the results exceeded even the most optimistic projections, grossing over $1 billion worldwide, making it the highest-grossing DC film ever released at the time, an opening that eclipsed Justice League's entire domestic run. Critically, the reception was more mixed than some of James' previous successes, currently sitting at a 66% approval score, with many praising the visual imagination and world-building, while others criticized the crowded story and overstuffed third act. Audiences, however, were far more enthusiastic, helping drive the film to massive commercial success through repeat viewings and word of mouth. But after conquering horror, action, and superheroes, James Wan decided to return to the genre that made him famous. But this time, the magic wouldn't quite strike the same way. In the spirit of full transparency, I don't acknowledge or count the next 2 films as part of James' filmography. I would have been perfectly happy if he rode off into the sunset after Aquaman, but for the credibility and accuracy of this video, I have to talk about them. So Malignant revolves around Madison Mitchell, a woman who begins experiencing horrifying visions of brutal murders, only to discover that the killings are actually happening in real life. As the bodies pile up and suspicion starts pointing in her direction, Madison is forced to uncover the disturbing connection between the murders and a mysterious figure from her childhood named Gabriel. At its core, Malignant is a story about trauma and the way the past can continue to haunt us long after we think we've escaped it. It explores the idea that childhood pain doesn't simply disappear. It stays with us, shaping who we become, sometimes in ways we don't even understand.
James and I had always wanted to create something together, and so I started pitching him some ideas. We found this little seed that we wanted to grow together, and he actually fell in love with it. We poured each other into the material, into the story, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
The film was produced on a budget of roughly $40 million and completed shortly before the pandemic turned the industry upside down. Warner Bros. Ultimately chose to release it simultaneously in theaters and on HBO Max as part of their streaming strategy, which put the movie in a very different position than most of James' previous theatrical releases. So financially, the results were very disappointing, earning just under $35 million worldwide, making it one of the few clear box office losses of James Wan's career. The streaming release undoubtedly hurt the theatrical run, but the marketing also struggled to communicate what the movie actually was. Malignant felt like James revisiting ideas and techniques that had worked earlier in his career, but with a much more exaggerated and self-aware twist. But unfortunately, things were about to get worse, because the next movie that followed became the lowest-rated film of James Wan's career. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom picks up with Arthur now fully settled into his roles as both King of Atlantis and a new father. But his attempt at a quiet life is short-lived, as Arthur gets forced out of his peaceful life as king when Black Manta returns with a powerful ancient weapon capable of destroying both Atlantis and the surface world. To stop him, Arthur reluctantly has to team up with the last person he ever wanted to work with. By the time the sequel entered production, the landscape around DC had changed dramatically. Warner Bros. Was undergoing major restructuring, several DC films were struggling at the box office, and audiences had largely lost confidence in a cinematic universe that seemed to be constantly changing direction. Unlike the first Aquaman, which arrived with excitement and momentum, this sequel felt like it was swimming against the tide before it even reached theaters. The budget, however, reflected the studio's confidence in both James Wan and the previous billion-dollar payday they had received from his previous installment, sitting at a reported $215 million, making it the most expensive projects James Wan had ever directed. Unfortunately, the results were nowhere near the first film, grossing a little over $439 million worldwide, which in itself is not a terrible number. But when you factor in a $200 million plus budget and the heavy marketing spend following one of DC's biggest hits ever, this was a significant flop and major step backwards. Financially, it became one of the biggest disappointments of James Wan's career, not necessarily because it lost the most money, but because of the sheer drop from its predecessor. Going from over $1 billion to less than half that same amount is the kind of decline that studios run away from. But one disappointing sequel doesn't change the bigger picture. While working on this film, James was also developing the story for Megan, alongside Akilah Cooper, which went on to gross over $180 million worldwide, against a budget of just $12 million. Today, James Wan ranks as the 16th highest-grossing director of all time, a monumental feat for a predominantly independent filmmaker who built multiple billion-dollar franchises on extremely low budgets. Doing research for this video gave me a whole new appreciation for James Wan and Lee Wan-el, two young filmmakers who flew to Los Angeles with nothing more than a short film, a script, and a dream.
It's actually our manager in Australia who suggested going to LA with our script. She was like, come on, because we tried to make the film in Australia and it just wasn't happening. And so as a last-ditch attempt to get the film made, she said, let's go to LA. And we didn't want to go because we didn't have any money. We were all broke. But somehow she convinced us to go over.
Thanks for joining me on this journey through the career of one of modern cinema's most remarkable filmmakers. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please consider leaving a like or hype on this video so it reaches other movie fans. And also let me know in the comments who you'd like to see next. Thank you so much for watching.